TitleMatchNetwork.com.
Let's talk about your relationship with Sonny Ono. You actually met him before you were in the business, and you created the Ninja Star Wars toys?
Yeah, Sonny and I go back to the days when I was very involved in martial arts. And Sonny was a martial arts school owner in Mason City, Iowa. And he and I first met on the tournament circuit. And he was very close to some of the people that were in my school and some of the black belts in my school. And Sonny was a very prolific competitor. He was a great kickboxer in his day, and he was also very good in the portion of tournament competition called kata or form. It's
Right.
one of the best in the country, actually. So we became very, very close, and I've told the story many times. It's in my book, but one night he and I were sitting down, probably in a bar, and I'm sure there was a couple beers involved. And he's almost the same age I am. And we were talking about how ironic it was that, at the same period of time, he was a kid growing up in Tokyo, just outside of Tokyo, and I was a kid growing up just outside of Detroit. And we were kind of comparing notes on what our respective lives were like, during that period of time. And he used to tell me that, yeah, when I was a kid, we'd run around, we'd pick up milk bottle caps, I think is what they were. And they would, play tag with them. In Detroit, we would go around and we'd just pick up, big clumps of dirt and rocks and shit in the street and chuck that at each other, and we'd play army, or we'd have war with rocks. It was bloody but fun. But we compared those notes, and somehow, I don't know how we did it, but somehow we came up with the Ninja Star Wars game idea, and
there you go.
There you go.
You met with AWA initially to try to pitch getting advertising for Ninja Star Wars. How did you end up with the company just a few months later?
That was really an interesting coincidence. Sonny and I were both very long on confidence and very long on ambition, and very short on knowledge and experience when it came to marketing a kid's game. He had no idea how to do it.
Right.
But we designed a hell of a game. We found a manufacturer over in Korea. We begged, borrowed, stole, leveraged everything we had to get these games manufactured. And lo and behold, at one point, a truckload of 10,000 of these games showed up, because you can't make 2 or 3 of them. You got to make a bunch of them. So we had all these games, shipped to my house. I stashed them in every corner of the house, and my friend's house, and my neighbor's house, because we didn't have a warehouse. And then we went, okay, now, how do we sell these damn things? And we struggled. We did little demos in malls, and kids loved playing them, but we just couldn't really figure out how to get them on the shelves at the retail level. So I remember sitting at home one afternoon. I was watching ESPN, and that was when the AWA was on ESPN, like at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Minneapolis. And I thought, wait a minute now. I know for a fact Verne Gagne supports amateur wrestling. I had met Verne previously, and I wrestled in Minnesota in high school. And I know that he'll take a meeting if I just get him on the phone. So I literally picked up the phone, called the AWA offices, just cold, out of the blue. And very spontaneous. And I told them who I was, and I made sure they understood I was a wrestler at Minnetonka High School in 1973. And, I'd met Verne before at the regionals in Mound, where he went to high school. So it worked, and I got a meeting with Verne and the entire team that Verne had working for him at the time. And I went in with a couple games, and I just pissed my ass off. I put little vests on everybody and broke out a couple games, and before you knew it, Greg Gagne and his secretary and Verne and a couple of people, they're throwing these stars at each other and they're sticking to them. They had a blast. And essentially we did a deal that basically said, I'll cover the games, which I had already done. I'll handle all the fulfillment or the shipping of the games. And whatever we make, if you do the advertising on your show, and I'll even produce the commercial, which I had no idea how to do. But if I produce a commercial, I'll do the games, I'll handle the fulfillment, you advertise it, and we'll split the money 50-50. I said, sure, let's give it a shot. So we did. And we sold some games, and we learned a lot about fulfillment and shipping and
right.
credit card orders in the process. Got a very good education. And ultimately, it didn't work very well from the game perspective. But I, in the process, developed a relationship. And Verne saw that I was a good salesman. I really was. I was passionate about the game. I was energetic and young. And Verne literally offered me a job handling his syndication at AWA as a result of the experience with the game.
And did you know anything at that time about syndication at all, or?
Not really. Not really. I learned pretty quickly. I mean, sales is sales.
Right.
Once you learn a little, you learn your product, you learn your customer, you get in your car and you go knock on doors. It doesn't really matter too much unless you're selling something very technical. Sales is sales. You just have to learn your market, learn your customer, learn your product, and work your ass off. And I did. I was so enthused because at that point, when I got the job at AWA, first of all, it was, you know, I think it was like $600 a week, which at that time seemed like a fair amount of money to me. And just the idea of being involved in the wrestling business and the business side of it was so exciting to me. Working for Verne was so exciting to me that it was easy for me to learn what I had to learn. And, I had a lot of passion by the time I got to whatever television station I was going to pitch it.
What were the day-to-day operations like for you in the AWA?
Well, it changed a lot, from the period of time that I started in syndication to, the way it ended up. It changed very rapidly for me. But I've always focused just on syndication. Um, I'd go into the office a day or 2 days a week, maybe Monday, Tuesday, and then I'd go out on the road. I'd go into Iowa, I'd go into Nebraska, I'd go to the Dakotas, I'd go into Wisconsin, wherever there was a regional television station where Verne wanted to promote live events. My job was to go to the independent television stations in those markets and try to sell the show. So it was a day or two in the office and then a day or 2 or 3 out on the road and back home.
Did you go to any shows at all? Or
Oh,
you pretty
yeah.
much, okay, so
Oh,
you
yeah.
hung around. Okay.
Of course.
All right. What were your impressions of Verne and Greg around this period of time?
Well, I looked up to Verne and still do to this day. And Greg. There's still Greg and I haven't talked now in about a year and a half, but that's not because of anything other than distance and time. But I was very respectful of Verne and grateful to him for giving me a job in the business, and I really enjoyed it. We became friends through that period of time. I used to go hunting with Verne and Greg on the weekends, and we'd spend family time together. I'd go over their house on Christmas, and um, got him a dog as a gift, a hunting dog that I knew he really liked. So we really became pretty close friends.
Do you think Verne knew he was towards the end of his run as a promoter around this period of time? Because I think this was his final year in business, right?
Well, I went to work for him in '87,
Okay.
and I think I was there for a couple of years. So,
Okay.
look, Verne was, and in spirit always will be, one of the most stubborn, tenacious, aggressive people that I've ever really known. And sure, he knew he had to know he was having financial difficulties, but he refused to believe that his formula and his approach to business ultimately would not be successful. And he refused to quit. That's part of why he became successful in the first place. I think towards the end, he realized that, he was 70 years old and financially he was getting his ass kicked. And that was mostly because of the local government in Minnesota, through a law called eminent domain, was taking all of his property, which is where all of his money was, and offering him a quarter of what it was really worth. And that was really his biggest asset. So when that happened, it really took the wind out of his sails.
Did you ever interject and maybe give him some ideas on thoughts that you? No, okay, not at all.
No, I was never able to. That just wasn't my role.
Okay, all right. Did you get to interact with any of the talent there at the time, like maybe Wahoo McDaniel or any of the boys?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. In fact, Wahoo McDaniels gave my son Garrett his very first bump in the business. Garrett came to work with me one day, and I think he was like 3 or 4 years old, and Wahoo and I and Ray Stevens and Greg were kind of hanging around. I think it was at the end of the day. We were just hanging around the lobby, shooting the breeze. And Wahoo was wrestling around with my son, and he kind of picked him up and started shaking him around a little bit, having fun with him, and he accidentally dropped him on his head. So, yeah, and I like I said, I hunted with Wahoo and Ray and Greg and had a lot of fun with them. Kurt Hennig, I got to interact with, and Medusa, and that's where I got to know her. So yeah, we got some good friends.
What about Nick Bockwinkel? Early memories of Nick?
Well, yeah, I mean, he's one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. I didn't really work with Nick hardly at all in Minnesota. I mean, a little bit as when I took over as the guy doing the interviews, I occasionally had to interview him. But Nick and Verne conducted most of their business together, and I was really never a part of that process.
Larry Nelson disappeared, and he no-showed promo day, and you ended up doing TV interviews. What are your memories of that day? That was the, I guess, the famous DUI. Whatever happened to him?
Yeah, and Larry, rest in peace. Larry was a great announcer. You know, the only real disadvantage about Larry is he was a big guy. I think he was like 6'2" or 6'3", if I remember. He was a really big guy. And of course, when you're the announcer, you're the guy holding the stick, especially with someone like Verne, who was really, really focused on, you know, perception and all. That was his disadvantage. But he had a great voice. He had a great sense of timing. Um, but Larry liked to have a cocktail or two. And I guess he went out one night and had a cocktail or two, and it was just wrong place at the wrong time, and didn't make it to work the next morning because he was trying to get bailed out of jail. And in the interim, Verne had flown all of his talent because he did this once a month. He would fly 30, 40, 50 people, however many people were on his shows. He would fly them all in once a month, and they would spend an entire day or 2 days doing what they called back then market edit promos that would be inserted in the local shows. You do the same interview over and over and over again, but instead of me wanting to kick your ass in Chicago, I'd be kicking your ass in Milwaukee, and then I'm going to kick your ass in Beloit, and on and on and on. Well, Verne Gagne had flown all these people in, and they're waiting and waiting and waiting, and there's no Larry. And it became apparent that there was an issue. And I don't know whose idea it was. I think it was Greg's. He said, well, you know, Eric's here. He's a good-looking guy. You know, he's a model. He did commercials, and he's got a tie on. I think I was the only person in the building that actually had a tie at the time. And said, come on in here. We're going to do this. I'm like, whoa, okay. I had no idea that it was going to happen.
Were you comfortable?
No.
Okay.
Oh, it was horrible.
Yeah.
It was a disaster. And I got to tell you, the first one I did, I think, I don't know the first person I did. The first person I did, it may have been Brad Ringens, or somebody who was really trying to help me. It was the first one, and it was horrible. But it was Larry Zbyszko is the one I remember the most, because I got to Larry, and I'm trying to remember, you know, everything that I'm supposed to remember, because it was just, you know, you had to hit a bunch of points in 30 seconds and give them time to talk and close it up. And it was nerve-wracking for me because I'd never done it before. And I had the guy standing behind the camera, you know, giving me, and I'm going, what the hell, you know, what does this mean? I don't know. What does this mean? I don't know. But I get wound up, and I'm trying really, really hard. I think Larry at the time was a world heavyweight champion, so it was kind of an important thing. And I set the whole thing up, and I looked at Larry, and I handed him the mic, and he just busts out laughing. I mean, he couldn't control it. He was belly laughing. I thought he was going to cry. And of course, everybody else in the room did too. And I was laughing on the inside, but I wanted to like put an ice pick in my thigh on the outside. It's like so embarrassing. But we got through it. And it was temporary. It was not supposed to last. It was just supposed to do one day. And then they hired somebody else to come in and do it. And he was actually worse than me. And I did it again the following month. And then he hired somebody else, and that didn't work out. And I did the following month. After about 6 months of that, I got to the point where I was almost tolerable.
Let's talk about the AWA TV tapings in Minnesota at the time. Obviously, it was hard building any momentum against WWE at the time. What lessons did you learn from working for the company during what was truly a hard period for the company?
You know, it's hard for me to say that I learned anything, because I wasn't involved in any aspect of the process other than running a camera or doing the interviews or doing play-by-play. I wasn't really in the business side of the business, and I was never really involved in the strategy or the tactics or trying to become successful when they weren't. So I just wasn't exposed to that type of thing. What I learned really during that period of time was what I consider to be the foundation of the business. I learned syndication. I learned the cable side of the business. I learned the promotion side of the business. I promoted live events. I promoted some house shows. I developed a corporate marketing campaign with one of the biggest brewers in the Midwest, G. Howman Brewing Company, for a very massive sponsorship, by the way, for that company at that time. So I learned a lot about the business of the business, but I wasn't involved in the wrestling side other than my role as an announcer. And Verne and Greg both were phenomenal teachers. I learned the importance of feeling what you're calling as opposed to memorizing what you want to say and saying it while it's happening. I learned the importance of keeping elements of the business a little mysterious and not constantly peeling back every layer of the onion so that there's nothing left to be interested in. which is one of the reasons why it's taken you 10 years to get me to sit down and do an interview,
Yeah,
quite
really.
frankly. I learned those things, and I consider them to be the foundation of the business.
How much credit would you give Verne for opening the door to your success in the business?
100%.
100%.
100%. Would have never. There's not a day. Well, that's exaggerating. There's not a week goes by that I don't think about it, think about him, and acknowledge how grateful I am for that opportunity, because it changed my life. It changed my kids' lives, my wife's life. I don't know what I would be doing right now had he not given me the opportunity he did.
When did you realize that it was, pretty much over for the company?
I don't remember the dates because we're going back 15,
Yeah.
17, 18, 20 years, but it was, you know, I realized it when I wasn't getting paychecks anymore. I realized it when things were financially so tight for Verne that I would go for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks without a check. And when I did get a check, it was a partial check. And they were towing the cars out of my driveway and foreclosing on my house. And I was feeding my kids rice and beans. And, the handwriting was not only on the wall, it was on my forehead every morning when I looked in the mirror.
Do you have a backup plan at that period of time,
No.
or no?
No.
Just going with the punches?
No, I wasn't just going with the punches. I was determined to stick it out as long as I possibly could, because I knew once I got out of the business, there would be no way I'd get back in. No.
What do you think the legacy of the Gagne family and AWA should be?
That's, I'm not objective about that because I feel so strongly about them personally and for what they've done for my family. But Verne, if you cut through all the obvious things that went wrong towards the end, and you look at the things that went right, not only for Verne and for that territory, but for so many people that had the opportunity to come through that territory and learn from Verne. And so many of them did, including Hulk Hogan, Kurt Hennig, Sergeant Slaughter, so many people of that era, and so many more that I can't, name them all.
Right.
But such a vast wealth of talent came through there. And by the way, they weren't that talented when they got there. They learned from Verne and Greg, because Verne was a master, and he wouldn't tolerate mediocrity when it came to certain aspects of the business, because he knew that business. And I think he should be recognized for that.
Later, when you were working for WCW, Greg, was brought into the company. Was that more or less a thank you for everything the Gagnes have done for you?
Yes and no. Part of it, of course. I'm not going to deny that. But part of it was because I did then and still do have a lot of respect for Greg's point of view about wrestling. When it comes to things that took place in the ring, or even directing a promo or an interview, Greg, through his father, had a very strong fundamental knowledge and a great feel for how to make it feel real. And we needed that in WCW at the time. So it was a two-part.
Okay. Let's talk about your background. Before you came into the wrestling business, you grew up in Detroit. What are your memories of growing up in that area?
Well, I was born there in 1955, and I left in, I believe, 1968 or 69. So I was very young, when I left. But I lived in a part of town, 10 Mile and Gratiot, not too far from 8 Mile. But it was, in many ways, it was a great place to live as a kid. It was before Detroit was really in a big decline. It was a tough neighborhood in many respects, but in other respects, there were some great families, and I enjoyed growing up there in many respects. But it was a tough place to live. Watched wrestling as a kid there on CKLW, Big Time. I think it was called Big Time Wrestling.
Yep, Big Time Wrestling.
On CKLW Channel 9 every Saturday morning, right before or after Sky King. So that was a ritual for me on Saturday mornings.
Who are some of the guys that you like to watch on TV back then for Big Time Wrestling?
It's hard for me to remember, and I moved around a lot as a kid. So, as you know, when you move from one region of the country to the other, or back then at least, the wrestlers kind of crossed over in some respects. But I remember the Sheik and Bobo Brazil, and
Art Thompson.
I believe that Dick the Bruiser was there at that time. So
Did you go to any house shows at
No,
all?
no,
Okay, so you just watch it on TV as a fan.
No, yeah, as a kid, both my mom and dad worked. We only had one car. So on Saturday mornings, when both my parents were working, that was my little brother and I. That's, was our time to sit and control the one television in the house and watch wrestling. So
Early on, did you want to get into the wrestling business? Because, almost every little kid wants to be a wrestler when they grow up, so.
no, that's what's really ironic is at no time in my life did I ever think about, anticipate, wonder how to get into the wrestling business. It never occurred to me that I'd be anywhere near the wrestling business. I always enjoyed it. I watched it in Detroit growing up. When I moved to Pittsburgh, I was a big fan of wrestling in Pittsburgh. I moved to Minneapolis and still continue to watch it. And that was where some of my most vivid, recollections of wrestling, took place when I was a kid. But at no time did I ever imagine that I would be in the business.
Talk about your professional life before you got into the wrestling business.
Now I know why you wanted to do this over the course of an 8-hour day.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of things. I used to joke around that I think I've had a job that begins with every letter in the alphabet, but like 2 or 3. There's really not much I haven't done. I don't think I've ever been a zookeeper. I couldn't think of anything that started with a Q. Other than that, I think I've got it pretty much covered. But professionally, I guess anything I did over an extended period of time, starting with before I got into wrestling, I was a sales manager for a food processor, basically. And I had salespeople working underneath me, despite what, some of the things that have been said and written and expounded upon
Right.
creatively. But I was a sales manager. I hired and trained and managed a team of salespeople that worked for a food processor, and they sold food, residentially, but in large bulk and volume. So I was doing that before I got into wrestling. Prior to that, I was in martial arts. I managed a karate school. I competed as a kickboxer, both as an amateur and for a very short period of time as a professional. Fought on ESPN. So I was very involved in that for a long period of time, but it didn't pay the bills.
College background?
I went to college. I was there for about 5 minutes at a couple parties, but I got thrown out of the dorm when I was a freshman for playing just a little too hard.
Right.
And never went back. I tried to go back. I went to the University of Minnesota for a short period of time, but I was really I couldn't afford it, and my interests weren't really there.
So you're pretty much a true entrepreneur. You're pretty much self-made.
Always have been. While I was at the University of Minnesota, I started a landscape company because I had always done landscaping in the summer times, when I was in high school. And I started a landscape company with a friend of mine, and I don't know how we did it, but we grew it to be one of the largest commercial landscape companies in Minneapolis back at the time.
TitleMatchNetwork.com